Monsters, you see, don't always come with fangs and claws. Sometimes they come wearing the face of the person you love most.
After 27 years of marriage, you think you know a person's soul. You think you've memorized the topography of their face, the sound of their breathing in the dark, the exact way their hand feels in yours. You think the man who once cried when your first baby took her first steps, who held you so tightly at your mother's funeral that you felt his heart breaking with yours, who whispered, "Till death do us part," and made you believe it. You think that man would at least have the decency to look you in the eye when he's about to shatter your world into a million unrecognizable pieces. You would be wrong. Monsters, you see, don't always come with fangs and claws. Sometimes they come wearing the face of the person you love most. Sometimes they've been sleeping next to you for nearly 3 decades, quietly sharpening the knife they will one day use to carve you out of your own life. And you will never, ever see it coming. It was a Tuesday. I remember that with a strange, useless clarity, because Tuesdays were always my grocery shopping days. I was sitting at our kitchen table, the one we'd bought at a flea market a month after we were married, making a list. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a perfectly ordinary moment, the kind you live a million times and never think to remember. Then Richard walked in from work. He still had his tie on, that navy blue one I'd bought him for his birthday 3 years ago. But something was off. His posture was stiff, unnatural, like a man bracing himself for a physical blow. His shoulders, which I had massaged 1,000 times, were rigid. "Eleanor," he said, and my pen stopped moving across the paper, leaving a small, dark blot of ink next to the word milk. In 27 years, he had never said my name like that. It wasn't the warm, familiar Ellie he used in private, or the affectionate hun he used in public. It was my full name, clipped and formal, like something distasteful he had to get out of his mouth quickly. I looked up at him. This man whose shirts I'd been ironing for nearly 3 decades, whose coffee I'd made every morning, whose aging mother I'd cared for in our own home until the day she passed. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, more styled than usual, I noticed with a detached sense of curiosity. And he wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on a spot on the wall just over my head. "We need to talk," those 4 words. They hit my chest like a spray of ice water, but I forced myself to keep my hand steady, to keep writing. Milk, bread, bananas, normal things, safe things. "About what?" I asked, though something deep in my gut, a cold, hard knot of intuition, already knew. He didn't answer right away. He just pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals. The table where we'd helped our kids with their homework, where we'd planned vacations and argued over bills and dreamed about our future. The dark wood was a map of our life together, scarred and worn from years of living. There was the faint white ring from where our son, Liam, had set down a hot mug when he was 16. There was the deep gouge from when our daughter, Chloe, had dropped a pair of scissors during a school project. And there, near the corner, were our initials, carved like a pair of lovesick teenagers one night when we were drunk on cheap wine and 20 years of marriage. "I want a divorce," he said. The words didn't explode. They just hung there in the quiet, sunlit kitchen, thick and suffocating like smoke. I stared at him, at the stranger wearing my husband's face, and I waited for the punchline. I waited for him to crack a smile and say he was joking, waited for anything that would make sense of the sudden, violent fracturing of my world. But his face was a mask of cold, businesslike seriousness. "A divorce," I repeated, the word foreign and ugly in my mouth. "I'm not happy, Eleanor," he said, and his voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. "I haven't been happy for a long time." Happy, the word hung between us, an indictment. As if happiness was some utility I was in charge of providing, like electricity or running water, and I had failed to pay the bill. As if my entire worth could be measured by his level of personal satisfaction. I thought of my teaching career, the one I had loved, the one I had given up without a second thought to raise his children. I thought of his mother, her frail body withering from cancer, and the 2 years I spent as her full-time nurse, changing bedpans and administering medications so she could die with dignity in our home. I thought of every dinner I'd cooked, every school event I'd attended alone, every compromise I'd made to keep the machinery of his life running smoothly so he could be free to pursue his own version of happiness. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and high-pitched to my own ears. "What aren't you happy about?" He finally looked at me then, and the expression in his eyes was worse than anger or frustration. It was pity. The clinical, detached pity a doctor gives you before delivering a terminal diagnosis. "We're different people now," he said. "You've gotten so set in your ways, so." He paused, searching for the word, the perfect, polished stone he could use to kill our marriage. The word I heard in my head was old, boring. I was 50 years old, with laugh lines etched around my eyes from smiling at his jokes and silver streaks in my hair from worrying about his children. My body was the soft, lived-in vessel that had carried his son and daughter. Old. "I need something different," he finally said, his gaze sliding away from mine again. "Someone who makes me feel alive again." And there it was, the someone. Because men like Richard, comfortable, complacent men, they don't detonate a 27-year marriage unless there's someone else waiting in the wings with a soft place to land. Someone to catch them as they leap from the marriage bed they have grown tired of. "Who is she?" The question was out before I could stop it, a sharp, ragged sound in the quiet room. His face flushed a deep, telltale red. "Caught. It's not about anyone else, Alina. It's about us, about what we've become." But it was too late. His lie was as transparent as glass, and suddenly, all the little signs I had willfully ignored clicked into place like a key in a lock. The late nights at the office, the expensive new cologne that smelled nothing like the scent I knew. The sudden, renewed interest in the gym after years of dad bod comfort. The hushed phone calls he'd started taking out on the back porch. It was a pathetic, predictable cliche, and my life had just become the punchline. "What's her name, Richard?" I asked again, my voice colder this time, demanding the name of my replacement. He stood up then, unable to sit still under the weight of my direct gaze, and began packing to the window that looked out on the garden I'd planted from scratch, the roses I had nursed through 15 unforgiving summers. He stared out at my flowers as if they held the answer. "Sophie," he said finally, his back still to me. "Her name is Sophie." "Sophie, of course." It was a name that sounded like sunshine and careless youth, a name that didn't carry the heavy weight of shared sorrows and decades of compromise. "How old is she?" I asked, the question clinical, a desperate attempt to quantify the scale of my own obsolescence. I didn't want to know, I had to know. He was silent for a long moment. 28. 28, the number landed in the pit of my stomach and just sat there, a cold, heavy stone. When I was 28, I was 7 months pregnant with our son, Liam, making baby food from scratch for his older sister and learning how to be a mother while Richard was building his career. When I was 28, I thought 27 years of marriage was an eternity. It turns out it's just the length of a prison sentence you don't realize you're serving. "I'll be staying at a hotel tonight," he continued, turning back from the window, his voice now brisk, as if he were discussing business plans. "We can work out the details later. I'll be reasonable about everything, Alina. I'm not a monster." A monster? No, he wasn't a monster. Monsters at least don't pretend to be something they're not for 27 years. Monsters don't make you love them first. I watched him walk into our bedroom and pull a single suitcase from the top of the closet. Just one, as if that's all our shared life amounted to. I remembered him packing for our honeymoon, his clothes hopelessly tangled with mine in one oversized bag. I remembered him packing for business trips, how I'd always tuck a family photo into his luggage. This was different. This was a neat, solitary final act. He moved through the room like a stranger, his movements efficient and impersonal, carefully avoiding the photos on the dresser, the wedding picture on my nightstand. "The kids," I said, my voice hollow, when he was almost done. "I'll call them tomorrow," he said, not looking at me. "Explain everything." Explain, as if there was any explanation that would make sense to Chloe and Liam, our grown children who still believed in the fairy tale that had created them. He paused at the bedroom door, suitcase in hand. "I'm sorry, Alina, I really am," he said, "but I can't keep pretending to be someone I'm not." And then he was gone. The front door clicked shut, and I was left utterly alone in the house we bought as newlyweds, surrounded by the deafening silence of a life that had just been declared dead. 27 years, gone in 27 minutes. But as I sat there on the edge of our bed, my bed, now something besides heartbreak began to smolder in my chest. Something harder and much, much sharper. Because Richard had forgotten one very important thing in his haste to start his new life with young, exciting Sophie. He'd forgotten that this house, this life he thought he could just walk away from, was still half mine. 2 weeks, that's how long it took for the knife to twist completely. I'd spent those 14 days in a thick fog of disbelief, moving through the empty rooms of my house like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all the familiar sounds of living. No coffee maker gurgling in the morning, no evening news droning from the living room. No sound of Richard's key in the lock at 6:30 sharp. Just me and the echoes of a life that already felt like it belonged to someone else. I started sleeping in the guest room, unable to bear the vast, empty space in our marital bed. Our bedroom, once my sanctuary, now felt like a crime scene, still faintly smelling of his cologne. My daughter Chloe had driven up from the city, bless her heart, and spent 3 days force-feeding me soup and packing my kitchen while threatening to, in her words, beat Dad's ass into next week. Her anger was a temporary comfort, a warm fire to huddle by. My son Liam called every day, his voice careful and strained, caught in the impossible position of loving both his parents. "Mom, maybe this is for the best," he'd said the night before, trying to coat the poison pill in a thin layer of optimism. "Maybe you can both be happier apart." Happier, there was that word again. I was gathering the last of his things, a few shirts he'd left behind, a final, sad domestic chore I felt compelled to finish. I picked up the blazer he'd worn to that work conference in the wine country 3 months ago, a trip he'd insisted he had to take on our 27th anniversary. As I checked the pockets before putting it in a donation bag, my fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. It was a receipt from a luxurious spa resort, a place I'd always dreamed of visiting, but he'd always said was too extravagant. I saw the charges for a couple's massage, for champagne and strawberries delivered to the room. And there at the bottom was the date, our anniversary. And the guest name, Richard Mitchell and guest. He hadn't just cheated on me. He had used our sacred day to celebrate his new life, spending our money on a romantic getaway with her while I sat at home, alone, thinking he was in a boring work meeting. The fog of grief in my mind burned away in an instant, replaced by a cold, hard, diamond-sharp rage. That's when I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart gave a stupid, hopeful leap. Maybe he'd come to his senses. But when I looked out the kitchen window, it wasn't Richard's silver sedan. It was a bright red Mustang convertible, shiny and loud and offensively new. And climbing out of it was a woman who looked like she'd just stepped out of a magazine. Long blonde hair caught the morning sun as it fell over her shoulders. She wore tight jeans that probably cost more than my entire monthly grocery budget, and a pair of sunglasses pushed on top of her head like a tiara. She walked up the stone path I had laid with my own 2 hands, past the roses I had painstakingly pruned, and she didn't hesitate. She walked like she belonged there. The doorbell rang, a cheerful, jarring chime in the silent house. I stood frozen in my kitchen, the spa receipt still clutched in my hand, my coffee mug halfway to my lips. It rang again, followed by a series of confident, impatient knocks. With a deep breath, I walked to the door and opened it. "Hi, Alina," she said, her voice as bright and musical as the doorbell. "I'm Sophie." She said it with a dazzling smile, as if I should be delighted to finally meet her, like we were two women about to be introduced at a book club. She was beautiful, but not in a way that required effort. It was the careless, radiant beauty that only exists when you're young enough to take good skin and a fast metabolism for granted. No makeup, but she didn't need any. Clear blue eyes, perfect white teeth, and the kind of slender, toned figure I had once, before 2 children and 27 years of marriage had softened the edges. "I know who you are," I said, my voice coming out rough and scratchy, a voice I barely recognized as my own. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, then returned, now slightly different. It wasn't cruel exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It was the calm, placid smile of someone who has already won the game and is just waiting for the other player to concede. "Richard's told me so much about you," she said, her tone implying a deep, shared intimacy with my husband. "He said you were a wonderful mother to his children." His children, as if I had been a long-term babysitter whose contract had finally expired. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, my body a rigid wall in the doorway, refusing to grant her entry into my home. "Actually, yes," she said, her voice still bright. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. "Richard wanted me to give you this. He thought it might be easier coming from me." Easier for whom? I thought, my mind reeling. Easier for the coward who couldn't even deliver his own eviction notice. I took the envelope, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grasp it. She just stood there, watching me, waiting. With numb fingers, I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Richard's familiar, sloping handwriting. The handwriting I had seen on 1,000 anniversary cards and love letters. "Elena," it begins, no dear, no warmth, nothing. "I know this is difficult, but we need to move forward. Sophie will be staying at the house while we work out the divorce details. It makes sense since I'm paying the mortgage. I've boxed up your personal items, they're in the garage. Please pick them up at your earliest convenience. I hope we can be civil about this, Richard." The words swam in front of my eyes, blurring into an incomprehensible script of cruelty. "Staying at the house, your personal items, at your earliest convenience." I looked up from the letter, up at this young, beautiful woman who was standing on my front porch, holding my husband and my home hostage with her perfect, placid smile. "He moved you into my house," I said, the words flat dead. It wasn't a question. "Well, it's his house, right?" she said with a tilt of her head, a touch of genuine confusion in her voice, as if I were being unreasonable. "I mean, he pays for everything." She glanced past me into the hallway. And honestly, Elena, it needed a woman's touch. Some of the decorating was just so dated. Dated, the family photos I'd arranged on the mantelpiece, the curtains I'd sewn by hand. The life I had carefully, lovingly curated for 27 years, all dated. "Those are my roses," I said, my voice barely a whisper, nodding toward the garden. "Oh, were they?" she asked, a flicker of mild surprise. "Richard said they just came with the house." "Don't worry, I'm planning to rip it all out anyway. Something more modern, less cluttered." Something inside my chest didn't just break, it snapped. A rubber band stretched far beyond its limit. "This is my home," I said, my voice quiet but filled with a sudden, cold fury. She laughed, a light, airy sound. "Well, not anymore, but we'll take good care of it. Richard's already talking about putting in a pool." A pool, a gleaming, sterile blue pool right where our children had played, right where I had planted a memorial garden for Richard's mother. "I should go," Sophie said, glancing at her phone, the latest model, of course. I'm meeting the interior designer at 11. We're thinking of knocking out the wall between the kitchen and the living room, create more of an open concept. The wall Richard and I had painted a sunny yellow together when we first moved in. The wall where we'd measured our children's height every year on their birthdays, a ladder of pencil scratches that told the story of our family's growth. She turned to leave, her red convertible gleaming in the driveway, then paused as if remembering something. Oh, and a leaner, she said brightly. The garage code is still the same. Richard said you'd remember it. And then she was gone, our anniversary. The garage code was our anniversary date, 10/22. The day I had promised to love, honor, and cherish him. Now it was the password to the storage unit where he had dumped my life. I watched her drive away, watched her take the right turn at the end of our street, toward the life that was supposed to have been mine. I stood in the doorway for a long, long time after she was gone, holding that cold letter, feeling smaller and more invisible than I had ever felt in my 50 years on this earth. Richard hadn't just left me, he had erased me. He had boxed up my existence and put it in the garage like old Christmas decorations that were no longer in style. But as I stood there, a different kind of heat began to burn in my chest. It wasn't the hot flush of shame, but the cold, focused burn of pure rage. Because in his haste to install his new life in my home, Richard, in all his arrogant confidence, had forgotten one crucial, legally binding detail. One thing he'd overlooked in his rush to start over. I walked back into the kitchen, my movements no longer slow and grieving, but sharp and purposeful. I pulled open the drawer where I kept all our important papers and riffled through the folders until my fingers found it. The deed to the house. I pulled it out, my heart hammering. And there it was in crisp, black and white legalese that was colder and harder than any divorce letter. Richard James Vance and Alina Marie Vance as joint tenants with right of survivorship. My name, my full name, was still on that deed. After 27 years of marriage, after building this home from the ground up, after every mortgage payment and property tax bill, my name was still there. Richard might be paying the mortgage now, but I still owned half of everything he was so eager to give away to his 28-year-old girlfriend. I smiled for the first time in 2 weeks. It was not a nice smile. He'd forgotten that I wasn't just his discarded wife. I was his business partner, and this business partnership was about to get very, very interesting. My lawyer Isabel's office smelled of old books, expensive leather, and determination, two things I was desperately in need of. I'd called her that very afternoon, my hands still shaking with a furious energy as I clutched the deed to my house. Isabel Reyes had been my friend since college, one of the few people who'd remained a fixed point in my life through marriage, motherhood, and all the small, quiet compromises that had slowly erased the woman I used to be. While I was home raising bobbies, she was climbing the ranks at her law firm, becoming the kind of woman who wore power suits and never took no for an answer. Sitting across from her massive mahogany desk, I felt like I was looking at a ghost of a life I might have had. "Show me the deed," she said, cutting straight to the point, her voice all business. I slid the document across the polished wood. She studied it with the same sharp intensity she'd once used to dissect Shakespeare in our literature class, her dark eyes scanning the page methodically. I found myself holding my breath. "Joint tenants with right of survivorship," she read aloud, then looked up at me, a single eyebrow raised. "Elena, do you understand what this means?" "That my name is on it too," I said, my voice small. She leaned back in her leather chair, and for the first time, I caught the hint of a fierce, predatory smile at the corners of her mouth. "It means so much more than that," she said. "It means you own 50% of that property, not 49%. Not whatever Richard, in his infinite generosity, decides to give you, exactly half, equal ownership." The words settled over me like a warm, protective blanket. Equal ownership. After weeks of feeling like I was begging for scraps from my own life, that legal phrase felt like solid ground beneath my feet. But he pays the mortgage, I said, voicing the argument that Sophie had used, the argument I'd been repeating to myself in my head. Doesn't matter, Isabel said, waving a dismissive hand. You're both on the deed. The law sees you as equal partners in this asset. She turns to her computer. In fact, how many years did you contribute to the mortgage payments before you stopped working? I thought back about 8 years. I taught third grade until Chloe was born. And during the 19 years you were a stay-at-home mother, she continued, her fingers clicking across the keyboard, did you contribute to the household in other ways? Child care, housekeeping, elder care. I raised our children, I said, my voice gaining strength. I took care of his mother for 2 years when she was sick. I managed the household, the finances, everything. Isabel stopped typing and turned to face me, her expression serious and intense. Alina, listen to me. You did not stop contributing to that marriage when you stopped earning an external paycheck. You provided services that would have cost Richard hundreds of thousands of dollars if he had been forced to pay for them. That is not just love, that is economic contribution. Don't you ever let him or anyone else tell you otherwise. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than humiliation and grief. I felt validated, I felt seen. So what are my options? I asked, my voice firmer now, leaning forward in my chair. Isabel picked up a yellow legal pad and a pen. Several, she said, her handwriting a series of sharp, decisive strokes. First, we demand that Richard buy out your half. We get the house officially appraised to find out its current market value, and he pays you 50% of the equity in cash. The number she'd be talking about was staggering, and we both knew it. And if he can't afford to, I asked, a sliver of hope I couldn't quite suppress rising in my chest. Isabel looked up at me, her expression unreadable. Then we file a petition for partition by sale. We ask a judge to order the sale of the property. The house is sold and the proceeds are split right down the middle, 50-50. The words hit me like a lightning bolt, force the sale. I could make them sell my house, our house. The house where Richard thought he could so easily install his new life and erase mine. The house where Sophie was currently picking out paint colors and planning to knock down walls. They would have to move out, I said, the thought taking root in my mind. They would have to move out, Isabel confirmed. She leaned forward, her voice softening slightly. Alina, this isn't about revenge. This is about protecting your financial interests. You are legally entitled to your share of the marital assets, and that house is likely your single biggest asset. But even as she said it wasn't about revenge, something dark and deeply satisfying curled in the pit of my stomach. Richard had tried to erase me, to box me up and put me in the garage like I was nothing more than a seasonal inconvenience. He had stood by while that girl talked about my roses like they were weeds, my decorating like it was trash, my home, my life's work like it had never been mine at all. This wasn't just about money, it was about refusing to be made invisible. How long would it take? I asked. If Richard cooperates and agrees to the buyout, a few weeks. If he fights it and we have to go to court, she shrugged, it could be months. But Alina, you need to understand this. You hold all the cards here. He cannot sell that house without your signature. He cannot refinance it without your signature. He cannot do a single thing with that property without your consent. I hold all the cards. After 27 years of being the supportive wife, the one who always deferred to Richard's decisions about money and career and where we would live, I finally held the cards. And I knew exactly how I was going to play them. There's something else, Isabel continued, her voice gentler now. This divorce, how do you want to handle it? Are you going to fight for spousal support? Alimony, the word felt strange, like asking for charity from the man who had just told me I was too old and boring for him to love. I don't know, I admitted. Well, start thinking, she said, her tone firm again. You gave up your teaching career to support his. You're 50 years old and you're starting from scratch. You are entitled to support while you get back on your feet. Alina, don't let pride keep you from claiming what you are legally owed. He moved his girlfriend into your house and tried to throw you away like garbage. This is not the time to be generous. I thought about Sophie's dismissive smile, about Richard's clinical letter. Isabel was right. What do we do first? I asked. Isabel was already reaching for her phone. First, we get the house appraised. Then we send Richard a letter informing him of your legal position and demanding either an immediate buyout or a partition sale. And if he refuses, she smiled, and it was as sharp as a blade, then we file the paperwork and let a judge explain property law to him. I left her office with a folder full of papers and a feeling I hadn't experienced in decades. Power, reals, legal, undeniable power. The appraiser came on a Wednesday, a soft-spoken man who walked through my home with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. I followed him from room to room, watching him measure and photograph, seeing my life through his eyes. Beautiful hardwood floors, he murmured in the living room, kneeling to examine the oak planks Richard and I had refinished ourselves during our 10th year of marriage. I remembered the sweat, the smell of polyurethane, and the way we'd made love on the newly finished floor before the furniture was moved back in. The kitchen updates are nice, he continued, running a hand over the granite countertops I'd picked out, saving for months to afford them. Updates, improvements, words that were now translating my life's work into dollar signs. The call from Isabel came at 4:17 p.m. on Friday. Alina, are you sitting down? She asked. Is it bad? It's $420,000, she said. The number knocked the wind out of me. The house has appreciated significantly. Your half of the equity is worth $210,000. $210,000. Enough to start over, enough to be safe. Now comes the fun part, Isabel said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. I'm hand-delivering a letter to Richard this afternoon. The letter was a work of art. It was everything Richard's letter to me was not: formal, powerful, and backed by the full force of the law. It demanded either an immediate buyout of my $210,000 interest or an immediate sale of the property, with a 10-day deadline to respond before we filed the petition in court. It was, in the simplest terms, a declaration of war. Isabel delivered it at 5:30 p.m. on Friday, just as Richard would be getting home from work. She called me from her car minutes later. Mission accomplished, she said. I handed it directly to him. He was with the girlfriend. He went very pale and asked if I was serious. I told him the law doesn't care about his feelings. I wished I could have seen his face. For weeks, I had been the one reeling from shock, scrambling to make sense of a world turned upside down. Now, finally, it was his turn. The call came on Sunday evening. Helen, his voice was tight, controlled, the voice he used with difficult clients. We need to talk. I think we've said everything we need to say, Richard, I replied, my own voice surprisingly calm. This is ridiculous. You can't just force me to sell the house. I'm not forcing you to do anything. I'm offering you two options. $210,000, Helen, be reasonable. Where am I supposed to get that kind of money? Be reasonable, the same two words he had used as a weapon my entire marriage, whenever I wanted something that inconvenienced him. Be reasonable about the career I wanted to resume. Be reasonable about his mother moving in with us. Be reasonable always, which was his code for, put my needs first. That's not my problem, I said, and the words felt foreign and wonderful on my tongue. This is our home, Alina, our children's home. You can't just destroy it out of spite. Our home, I laughed, and the sound was harsh, unfamiliar. Richard, you moved your girlfriend into our bedroom 2 weeks after you left me. You had her deliver a letter like I was a tenant being evicted. You boxed up my life and put it in the garage. Do not talk to me about our home. He sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound. Look, maybe we moved too fast with the living situation. But it was too little, too late. The offer stands, I said, cutting him off. Buy me out or we sell. I can't get a loan for that amount, not now, he sputtered, the panic finally breaking through his controlled facade. Then we sell, I said. His next words were meant to wound. This isn't you, Elena. The Elena I married wouldn't do this. And there it was, the truth he didn't even realize he was speaking. The Elena he married wouldn't have done this. That Elena would have walked away quietly and accepted whatever scraps he offered. But that Elena was gone. You're right, I said quietly. The Elena you married is gone. You killed her 3 weeks ago. I hung up before he could respond. The calls from my children started the next morning. First, Liam, my sweet boy, trying to play peacemaker. Mom, Dad's really upset. He says you're being vindictive. Liam, what would you do if your business partner took half your company, gave it to his new girlfriend, and then told you to be reasonable about it? He was quiet for a long moment. Then Chloe called, her voice laced with a confusion that hurt more than Liam's mediation. Mom, I know you're angry, but forcing them to sell it's our childhood home. It feels so destructive. Your father burned it down when he moved another woman into our bedroom, Chloe. I'm just clearing away the ashes. After I hung up, I sat in my empty apartment and understood, for the first time, that I was truly on my own. The legal papers were filed on a Thursday in November, exactly 6 weeks after Richard had told me I was too old to love. Isabel called it a petition for partition by sale, but I preferred to think of it as an eviction notice wrapped in legalese. The court date was set for December 15th. In the weeks leading up to it, the war of attrition continued. Richard hired a lawyer who sent Isabel a series of increasingly desperate-sounding settlement offers. He would paint the house, he would buy me a new car, he would give me a lump sum of $50,000. It was insulting. It was as if he was trying to buy me off with trinkets, still fundamentally unable to grasp that I was not asking for a favor. I was demanding my equity. The morning of the hearing was gray and cold, the sky the color of dirty snow. I arrived early, wearing a simple black suit Isabel had insisted I buy. We're not the grieving wife today, Elena, she'd said. We are the business partner here to protect her assets. Richard was already there with his lawyer. Seeing him across the sterile courthouse hallway was like looking at a stranger wearing my husband's face. He'd lost weight, and his hair was styled in that new, youthful way. He looked like a man who thought he had gotten exactly what he wanted and was now just annoyed with the administrative cleanup. When our eyes met, he gave me a stiff, formal nod. The kind of acknowledgement you'd give a business associate you didn't particularly like. 27 years, and it had come to this. Polite strangers about to fight over the rubble of our dismantled life. Inside the courtroom, Richard's lawyer went first, his voice smooth and practiced. He painted a masterful picture of me as a vindictive, scorned woman, trying to destroy her ex-husband's life out of pure spite. Your Honor, he said, gesturing towards me, Mrs. Vance is acting not out of financial necessity, but out of a desire for revenge. She knows my client cannot afford to buy her out immediately, yet she refuses to consider any reasonable alternatives. Reasonable alternatives, I wanted to scream. I'd spent 27 years being reasonable. I was reasonable when his career required us to move 3 times in 5 years. I was reasonable when his mother needed end-of-life care, and I put my own life on hold to provide it. I was reasonable every single night he worked late while I raised our children mostly alone. And where had all that reason gotten me? Then Isabel stood up, and I remembered why I had loved her fierce, brilliant mind since we were 19. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm and cutting, this case is about property law, not marriage counseling. My client, Mrs. Vance, is a 50% owner of this property. She has the absolute legal right to petition for this sale. She offered Mr. Mitchell the opportunity to buy her out at fair market value. He declined. She has no legal or moral obligation to provide financing terms for her ex-husband's new life. She gestured to the pile of documents in front of her. Furthermore, Mr. Mitchell has moved his romantic partner into the marital home and attempted to illegally exclude Mrs. Vance from a property she legally owns. He has shown nothing but contempt for her rights as a co-owner. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes, nodded slightly, and I felt a tiny flutter of hope. The court cannot force Mrs. Vance to become an involuntary lender to her ex-husband, the judge said, her voice sharp. She is entitled to partition by sale. My heart hammered in my chest, victory. But the judge continued, and my hope faltered. However, she said, looking over her glasses at Richard, I am willing to give Mr. Vance additional time to secure financing. 30 days. 30 more days of limbo. 30 more days of Richard and Sophie playing house in my former life while I waited in my temporary apartment. But as I looked across the courtroom at my husband's face, I realized something fundamental had changed. The confident, vital man who'd walked in looking like he owned the world now looked pale and shaken. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, he was the one on unsure footing, the one scrambling, the one facing an uncertain future. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. Mr. Vance, you have 30 days, the judge concluded. If you fail, the court will order the immediate sale of the property. As we gathered our papers, Richard approached me in the hallway, his lawyer hovering a few feet behind him. Alina, please, he said, his voice low and strained. Can we just talk for a minute? I looked at this man I had loved for most of my adult life, this stranger. What do you want to say, Richard? I never wanted it to be like this, he said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Forcing me to sell the house, it's going to destroy me financially. The mortgage, the legal fees, starting over. He looked genuinely desperate. Isn't there some way we can work this out? And there it was, the moment I had been both dreading and waiting for. Richard asking me to save him. The same way he'd asked me to save his mother's last years by caring for her in our home. The same way he'd asked me to save his career by supporting him through the line years. The same way he'd asked me to save our family by putting my own dreams on hold for decades. For 27 years, I had been Richard's salvation, his soft place to fall, his safety net. No, I said quietly, there isn't. He stared at me as if I'd slapped him. Alina, this isn't you. You don't abandon people when they need help. You abandoned me when I needed help, I replied, my voice as cold and steady as my heart. You said I was old and boring. You moved another woman into my bed. What did you think that said about my worth? For the first time in our entire marriage, Richard Vance had nothing to say. You have 30 days, I said and walked away. The call from Isabel came on January 10th, 28 days after the court hearing. He couldn't get the loan, she said without preamble. I set down my coffee cup. After all the fighting, it was really over. So we sell, I said. We sell, she confirmed. Was I having second thoughts? A part of me felt sick at the thought of strangers walking through the rooms where I'd raised my children. But that part of me was no longer in charge. No second thoughts, I said, and I meant it. Let's sell. The realtor was a tiny dynamo of a woman who walked through my house with dollar signs in her eyes. I had driven over to meet her, using the key I still had a right to use. The house was empty. Richard and Sophie must have been out. Walking through those rooms felt like touring a museum of my former life. The furniture we'd picked out was still there, but all the personal touches were gone. The family photos had vanished from the mantelpiece, replaced by generic, soulless decorative objects. The kitchen counters I had saved for months to install were clear of all the small appliances and lived-in clutter that had made it a home. It looked like a showroom, beautiful, staged, and utterly devoid of life. The for sale sign went up the following Tuesday. The house sold in 3 weeks to a young couple expecting their first baby. The closing was scheduled for March 1st, exactly 6 months after Richard had told me I was too old to love. We sat across from each other at a long, polished conference table, the final papers spread between us like a peace treaty after a long and brutal war. Richard looked older than I had ever seen him. The stress of the last few months had carved new lines around his eyes. "Where will you go?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Sophie found us a rental across town," he said, and then laughed, a short, bitter sound. "2 bedrooms, no yard. She's not thrilled about the downgrade." I felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a sort of grim understanding. Love was easy when it came with a beautiful house and financial security. "I'm sorry it worked out this way," I said, and was surprised to find that I meant it. He looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time in months. "But you're not sorry about the house," he stated. "No," I said, "I'm not sorry about the house." After we signed away our shared life in black ink, he looked at me one last time. "I keep waiting for you to gloat," he said. "There's nothing to gloat about, Richard. We both lost. I thought you'd be happy, getting your revenge." Revenge, everyone kept using that word, as if my act of self-preservation was an act of aggression. I gathered my purse and stood up. "Richard, if I had wanted revenge, I would have fought for spousal support. I would have gone after your retirement accounts and your business assets. I would have made sure you paid, in cash, for every single one of the 27 years of my unpaid labor." I looked him dead in the eye. All I wanted was what was legally mine. That's not revenge, that's justice. I walked out of that office a free woman for the first time in my adult life. The check arrived a week later. I deposited it into a new bank account, one with only my name on it, and sat in my car in the parking lot, staring at the receipt. Elena Marie Vance, account holder, no cosigner, no joint ownership. That weekend, I drove to the coast. I found a small, weathered cottage for sale, 2 blocks from the beach, with an overgrown garden and a front porch that begged for a swing. It was imperfect and needed work, but when I walked through it, I could see a future. My future. I made an offer that afternoon. I spent the spring learning how to live alone, painting the walls colors Richard would have hated, planting flowers instead of vegetables, choosing beauty over practicality for the first time in decades. My daughter Chloe visited in May and looked around with wonder. "Mom," she said, "this place is so you." Maybe she was right. Maybe this woman had been there all along, just waiting for permission to exist. One evening, Liam called while I was on my porch, watching the sunset. "Dad and Sophie broke up," he said. I felt a flutter of something, not satisfaction, but a sense of cosmic balance being restored. "I'm sorry for your father," I told him, and I meant it. I know what it feels like to have someone you love decide you're not worth keeping. "He asks about you," Liam said. "He wants to know how you're doing." "Tell him I'm happy," I said, "or at least I'm becoming happy." As summer settled over my little town, I started volunteering at a literacy center, teaching other women how to write their own stories. They called it revenge, what I did, but revenge suggests I was trying to punish Richard. The truth is simpler and more profound. I was just trying to save myself. It took losing everything I thought I wanted to finally discover what I actually needed. A place that was entirely mine, a life shaped by my own choices, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I could survive the unthinkable and come out stronger on the other side.